I call the Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure to order. Pursuant to committee rules 5F and House Rule 11-2H4, the chair may postpone further proceedings today on any question of approving any measure or matter or adopting any amendment in which a recorded vote or the yeas and nays are ordered. And without objection, the chair is authorized to declare recess at any time. Today, the committee will consider H.R. 4460, the Disaster Recovery Reform Act, H.R. 3814, the No Human Trafficking on Our Roads Act, and H.R. 3813, the Combating Human Trafficking in Commercial Vehicles Act. Our first order of business is to consider the consideration of H.R. 4460, the Disaster Recovery Reform Act. I ask unanimous consent to discharge the Economic Development Subcommittee and call up H.R. 4460, and that it be considered read and open to amendment at any point. Is there an objection? Without objection, so ordered. I want to thank Subcommittee Chairman Barletta and Ranking Member Johnson for their leadership on this bill. This committee is responsible for some of the most important reforms in emergency management in recent history. After Hurricane Katrina and Superstorm Sandy, we passed bills to improve federal disaster assistance in the wake of those hurricanes. Once again, this country has been devastated by not one or two, but 3 monster hurricanes that have caused catastrophic damage and loss. The country is looking for us for help, for solutions, for changes to keep this level of destruction from occurring again. This bill will help do just that, and I appreciate the work of Chairman Barletta and Ranking Member Johnson on these issues. And with that, I'd like to recognize Subcommittee Chairman Barletta to explain the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to thank Ranking Member Johnson, Chairman Schuster, and Ranking Member DeFazio for partnering with me on this critical bipartisan legislation. The Disaster Recovery Reform Act improves the Federal Emergency Management Agency's disaster assistance and emergency management programs with a focus on mitigation before the storm, earthquake, flood, fire, or any other event. Placing an emphasis on mitigation will help save lives and taxpayer dollars as well as reduce property damage. We know for every $1 spent on mitigation, $4 to $8 are saved in avoided disaster recovery costs. And in the wake of Hurricanes Irma, Maria, and Harvey, we saw firsthand how strong mitigation and smart building standards help people in Florida avoid damage and losses and recover faster. The Disaster Recovery Reform Act will help ensure our communities are well equipped to better plan and prepare for, withstand, respond to, recover quickly from, and mitigate against disasters of all kinds. Focusing on mitigation will help disaster-prone communities across the nation build better and build smarter. This bill tackles other important issues such as wildlife prevention, building code enforcement, eligibility for disaster assistance, and agency efficiency and accountability. The catastrophic 2017 hurricane season devastated many parts of our nation. The legislation changes proposed in this bill will help the nation as a whole act proactively before disaster rears its head. This legislation will also facilitate the recoveries underway to help avoid some of the snags and challenges we have experienced in the past. We cannot stop disasters from happening, and every single one of our districts, Republicans and Democrats alike, will be impacted by disaster at some point. But what we can do is work together to ensure that we are continuing to provide FEMA with the programs, authorities, and resources to help our communities plan for, mitigate against, respond to, and recover from disasters. I believe we must do more to make our communities and our citizens resilient to disasters. Rather than asking what now after a disaster strikes, it is time we proactively ask, what's next? Before the next storm, flood, fire, earthquake, or other disaster hits. The Disaster Recovery Reform Act provides improvements that will do just that by making mitigation a priority. I thank my colleagues for joining me in driving this next critical reform in emergency management. I support favorably reporting H.R. 4460. Thank you.
I thank the gentleman and thank the gentleman for his work on this legislation. I now recognize Ranking Member DeFazio for a statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As has already been mentioned, 3 devastating Category 4 or 5 huge hurricanes, massive wildfires in the West. The Earth is changing, and we have to change the way we respond and anticipate these catastrophic events. This bill is a good step forward. Resiliency, that's the most significant change in this legislation. When evaluating pre-disaster mitigation projects, FEMA will consider whether the project will increase the level of resiliency and the extent to which state or local government has adopted and is enforcing strong building standards. This will reduce the risk or increase the resilience to future damage, hardship, loss, or suffering. When FEMA estimates the eligible cost of repairing, restoring, reconstructing, or replacing public facilities or private nonprofit facilities, they will base their estimate on consensus-based building design standards in a resilient manner. It also changes the pre-disaster mitigation program, which is very important. We save $3 to $4 of disaster costs or flood insurance costs for every dollar that we invest in pre-disaster mitigation. We don't do near enough of that. This bill would help move us in that direction. FEMA will have to transfer an amount equal to 6% of a disaster's cost into their pre-disaster mitigation fund. Because right now the fund receives many more requests than it can fund. This will help begin to address that backlog or that insufficiency. There's also provisions in this bill for wildfires, which have been a particular problem in my part of the country. We're having unprecedented wildfires. Again, conditions are changing, and we have to keep up. So this bill will allow states to use mitigation funds to take action to prevent or reduce the severity of future wildfires. And finally, in one of the disturbing notes of the efforts in Puerto Rico, we've had issues about contracting. In addition to the much publicized whitefish contract, there's another one called Cobra, another $200 million no bid, can't look at or audit kind of contract. And then found out recently, there was a $40 million contract for tarps, which were no delivered. And again, it was a company that had no history of government contracting. I don't know whose crony they were, but we got to get to the bottom of that. So this bill includes provisions to require FEMA to include contract information on its website and notify Congress so we have much more transparency in the future about the contracting activities at FEMA. So I recommend this bill to my colleagues. It's not everything we need to do, but it's a very good start. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman. Now recognize Ranking Member Johnson for a statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I support H.R. 4460, the Disaster Recovery Reform Act, of which I am an original co-sponsor. I want to thank you, and I also want to thank Subcommittee Chairman Barletta for working with us in a bipartisan manner. This bill is a prime example of the good policy that results when we work across the aisle. For the last several years, this committee has held numerous hearings on the importance of funding mitigation activities before disaster strikes and the need to build back stronger and smarter after disasters occur. This bill responds to what we have learned in those hearings and advances the nation's disaster policy forward. One of my top priorities on this committee has been to see that infrastructure built back should be built back more resilient after a disaster. We must stop the cycle of rebuilding disaster-damaged infrastructure to the exact same standard and condition it was in before the disaster. I'm particularly pleased that this bill will require rebuilding public infrastructure back to higher standards in a more resilient manner. For example, if City Hall floods, we should rebuild City Hall back elevated to withstand future floods. Under this bill, the Federal Emergency Management Agency will also have tools to encourage and incentivize states, tribes, and local governments to pursue better buildings at the forefront. A steady funding stream for pre-disaster mitigation activities will put the nation back on the path to being the leader in infrastructure resilience. In closing, I must once again commend Chairman Barletta for his bipartisan approach in the drafting of this legislation and for his acceptance of democratic ideas, and he truly negotiated this bill in good faith. I urge my colleagues to join me in supporting this measure, and I yield back.
I thank the gentleman and thank the gentleman for his work on this legislation. Do any of the members wish to be recognized for statements? Mr. Denham is recognized for a statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In 2017, natural disasters devastated many parts of our nation, including in California. We saw devastating wildfires. Today, we consider critical FEMA reforms that will help our communities better prepare for and recover from these major disasters. The Disaster Recovery Reform Act provides the federal government tools to proactively prepare for the next storm and break the cycle of spending billions of dollars rebuilding the same structures in the same places year after year. This package includes the language from my proposal, H.R. 4455, the Smart Rebuilding Act, which was introduced last week. Reducing the future of loss and lowering the cost of disasters throughout America is a wise use of taxpayer dollars. We need to stop waiting for a disaster and asking ourselves, okay, what now? What do we do now? And actually look proactively on what can we do next to have stronger buildings that can resist many of these disasters. This smarter government, for every $1 spent in mitigation, will save between $4 and $8 in avoided recovery costs. I commend the chairman for bringing this good governance legislation before the committee, and I urge my colleagues to report it favorably. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Any other members? Ms. Estes is recognized for a statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank the chairman and ranking member for their work on the Disaster Recovery Reform Act, which makes critical reforms to FEMA that will help states and U.S. territories rebuild smarter and more efficiently after major disasters. 1 out of every 10 constituents I represent is Puerto Rican, nearly 75,000 people. Most of them still have family and friends in Puerto Rico, and many are now providing a place for their loved ones to live while they wait for their homes to rebuild and for power to be restored to the island. While there's much more we need to do to address the ongoing humanitarian crisis in Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands, I commend this committee's actions in helping ensure that we do not find ourselves in this same position the next time disaster strikes. Everyone benefits when we rebuild stronger and better after a storm. Lives are saved, families get back into their homes more quickly, and the federal government doesn't foot the bill year after year for poorly constructed energy grids or roads or dams or bridges. In short, this bill helps focus the use of federal taxpayer dollars on resilience. That is simply smart policy. And we know for a fact that these investments work. One need no look further than Florida, where some of the strictest building codes in the country, spurred by major storms of the past, helped to spare millions of homes from destruction during Hurricane Irma. Importantly, this bill also provides a steady stream of reliable funding for pre-disaster mitigation, ensuring that proactive reinforcement of our infrastructure is given the same level of importance as post-disaster reconstruction. There is much more we need to do to ensure that taxpayer money is being well spent and to equip states and territories to rebuild stronger, better infrastructure, but this is an important first step. Once again, I'd like to thank this committee for its good bipartisan work on this bill, and I'm eager to see us bring it to the House floor for a vote as soon as we move it out of committee today. Thank you very much, and I yield back.
I thank the gentlelady. Other members that wish to be, Mr. Graves is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, there are two kinds of Americans out there, those that have been affected by a disaster and those that will. This year has certainly highlighted the fact that this country is vulnerable to hurricanes, vulnerable to floods with Hurricanes Harvey, Irma, Maria, and Nate, and the extraordinary impact that they've had on our states and territories. But it's also important to keep in mind that since 1980, we have actually spent approximately $1.3 trillion on well over 100 different disasters across this nation. So disasters have an extraordinary effect. It's not just about hurricanes and floods. It's wildfires, it's snowstorms, it's ice storms, it's droughts. You have tornadoes, earthquakes, all sorts of other types of disasters have an impact on this nation and an impact on our citizens. This bill is a fantastic step forward, and I believe one of the most significant pieces of legislation that this committee has worked on this year, next to ATC reform, Mr. DeFazio. This is a really important bill, and I think it reflects true on-the-ground problems that have been had throughout disasters across this nation through various types of disasters. A few things that are in here that are being addressed. Provisions in here like getting rid of this ridiculous duplication of benefits policy that somebody invented, causing a loan duplicative of a grant. Folks in Texas and Florida helped work with us, Republicans and Democrats, to get this in the base text of the bill. I want to thank the chairman, Mr. DeFazio, and many others for helping to do that. Putting language in here on timeline for when FEMA can come back and claw back dollars or attempt to claw back dollars instead of allowing this to go on for literally over 10 years following a disaster, trying to reinvent rules, incentivizing proactive efforts. Mr. DeFazio noted this. There's a CBO study that says you get $3 in cost savings for every $1 you invest. There's a National Institute of Building Standards study that says you get $4 in cost savings. Corps of Engineers claims $7.90. Whatever the figure is, the fiscally conservative thing to do is to lean forward, to be proactive. That's how you save dollars, and this bill begins to shift that paradigm. Stop spending billions and trillions after a disaster. Start leaning forward and ensuring that we're being resilient, that we're preparing for the future, and preventing our communities from being destroyed whenever these types of disasters come upon our communities. Mr. Chairman, this is exactly what we need to be doing. The flood insurance bill that we passed through the House a few weeks ago does the opposite, unfortunately. This bill leans forward. I want to make one note that much of this resilience mission is actually what the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers is supposed to be doing. In many cases, we have projects that have been around for years or decades that haven't been implemented. And we're now transitioning part of this mission to FEMA under the President's supplemental request. He's transitioning much of this to HUD. We have a responsibility in this committee to execute oversight over the Corps of Engineers aggressively, hold them accountable, have them implement these resiliency projects, and ensure that our communities can withstand these types of disasters as we move forward. But look, in closing, I just want to say thank you to the chairman, thank you to the ranking member, to the subcommittee chairman and ranking member. This is an excellent step forward that addresses some fundamental problems in disaster preparedness and response. Folks in Texas, Florida, Virgin Islands, and Puerto Rico are certainly going to benefit from this legislation. Yield back.
Thank the gentleman. With that, recognize Ms. Frankel for a statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all the members who participated in both these all the three bills that I'd like to speak in support of. On the disaster recovery, I just, my prior life before Congress, I was mayor of the city of West Palm Beach, and we had 3 hurricanes, and we prepared for many more. And this bill is a step forward for the federal government being a responsible partner. So I want to thank you for that. And as to the legislation on the sex trafficking, I think we all know that human trafficking is modern-day slavery. It happens everywhere in the United States and around the world. It is a highly profitable crime, forced labor and/or forced sex, and we must resist it in every way possible. And we have 2 bills here today that should help in that effort, and I want to thank my colleagues who brought them to us. And I yield back.
I thank the gentlelady, and with that, recognize Mr. Farenthold for a statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As many of you know, the district I represent, 27th District of Texas, Corpus Christi was the first, one of the first areas hit by Hurricane Harvey, actually probably Port Aransas across the bay. We've suffered substantial damage, and we're still struggling to recover. There's still debris on the ground, still work to be done. This bill makes a huge step forward in taking some of the lessons that we've learned from previous disasters and fixing some of those problems. And I'm very happy it's coming to the floor. I think it's going to be a great benefit to the entire nation, because as my friend from Louisiana pointed out, everyone is eventually going to be affected by some sort of a disaster. And we need smart recovery, and we need fiscally responsible recovery, doing things like improving the things that we repair, not building them back to second-rate standards, but improving them with modern standards. So maybe next time, or so not maybe, but certainly next time, there will be less damage happening. So I'm 100% behind this bill. I'm looking forward to its passage. But I do think, because we do have so many ongoing recovery efforts in Texas and in the Virgin Islands and in Puerto Rico, there's still lessons to be learned. We've gotten better since Katrina. We've gotten better since Ike. And we're going to get better as a result of the storms over this summer. We can't stop here. We've got to continue to be looking for ways to improve the process where we can more efficiently protect and save lives, where we can make improvements to the Stafford Act and other laws to help mitigate these disasters and help the people in need. I think this is a great big step getting there, but I don't think our work is going to be done. I think this committee and other committees in Congress need to continue to watch what's happening in the disaster recovery from these huge disasters and continue to learn and continue to improve. I think that's what the voters put us here to do, and I appreciate what we've done so far, but our work is not done. I do urge everybody to support this bill. But again, keep our eyes open for ways for continuous improvement. And I'll yield back.
I thank the gentleman, and I share his sentiments. We can do more. We probably will have another supplemental in the first quarter, which will take another bite at the apple of FEMA. And then it's my intention, in talking with Ranking Member DeFazio, to do something again next year before the hurricane season to continue to fine-tune and change and make the improvements we need to the FEMA legislation, the Stafford Act. So I thank the gentleman. With that, recognize Ms. Wilson for a statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I fully support the Disaster Recovery Reform Act, and I want to thank Chairman Barletta, Ranking Members DeFazio and Johnson, and the T&I staff for including the language that I provided to improve nursing home emergency preparedness. The measure requires FEMA to provide much-needed disaster response guidance and assistance to ensure that nursing homes and other long-term care facilities are better prioritized and can function or return to functioning status as soon as possible during and after power outages. This is a top priority for me. My district experienced extraordinary loss and suffering during this past hurricane season. My constituents and I are still deeply saddened and angered by the preventable heat-related deaths of 14 individuals, mostly seniors, who resided at the Rehabilitation Center at Hollywood Hills. On the heels of this tragedy, I vowed to do everything within my power to improve nursing homes' emergency preparedness to save lives in Florida and across the nation. The nursing home-related language in this bill is a big step toward that goal. In addition, I have taken steps including launching a local task force comprised of nursing home representatives, elected officials, first responders, and other stakeholders, convening a field hearing in my district on lessons learned on nursing homes emergency preparedness this hurricane season and the path forward from the Hollywood Hills incident with Representative Johnson and Representative Frankel. Working with stakeholders to draft legislative and administrative options to further address this issue. I look forward to working with this committee, other committees with jurisdiction over nursing homes and healthcare, FEMA, and other federal agencies to take the necessary steps to protect our most vulnerable citizens. I fully support this bill, and I urge my colleagues to do the same. And I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I thank the gentlelady, and with that, any other members wish to be heard? Seeing none, I will now consider the bill for amendment. Any members wish to offer an amendment? The gentleman from New York. Mr. Maloney is up first, I believe.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk, and I ask unanimous consent that it be considered as read.
Without objection, so ordered. The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 2 offered by Mr. Maloney.
Mr. Maloney is recognized to speak on his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, a number of us had an opportunity to travel to the island of Puerto Rico just 2 weeks after the hurricane. And the most urgent need described to us, in addition to basic supplies like food and water, was the essential need to secure blue tarps to cover the tens of thousands of homes that had lost their roof to the storm. Both our colleague Jennifer Gonzalez-Colon and Mayor Rosselló made clear that this one basic thing, blue tarps, was essential to allowing tens of thousands of residents to return to their homes or at least occupy them during the rainy season. But unfortunately, FEMA somehow awarded a contract for this 20 days after the storm, which amounted to about $30 million to a company in Florida called Bronze Star, which had no experience providing tarps, had no experience responding to any government contract, had no employees, had an address in a residential section, a single-family home in St. Cloud, Florida, and was run by two brothers with no capacity to provide this service. And 4 weeks went by before FEMA decided it had to cancel this contract and pull back the money, which means that about 7 weeks elapsed before we started the process in Puerto Rico of providing something as basic as covering material, blue tarps, for these tens of thousands of residents. So my amendment is very simple. And we still haven't got that job done because now 7 weeks elapsed and we've just started the contracting process, while meanwhile in Puerto Rico, tens of thousands of families are exposed to the elements at the worst time of year. It's completely unacceptable, and it cries out for a professional and independent review by the Inspector General of the Department of Homeland Security. So my amendment would simply require such a review be undertaken to understand how this contracting process could go so wrong, affect so many people, and to have a report returned to this body by the 180-day mark, so we understand exactly how to do this contracting better in the future. And I would expect that all members of this committee could support this common sense accountability measure, so we can do better in the future. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman for offering this amendment and working with us on this important issue. I think it's extremely important that we ensure transparency, accountability, and it's critical to minimizing waste and disaster spending. So I would urge all members to support Mr. Maloney's amendment. And with that, do any of the members wish to be heard on this amendment? Seeing Mr. DeFazio is recognized.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Obviously, I strongly support it. I mean, there is a pretty long and history of dubious contracts, particularly this year with FEMA, and the gentleman is absolutely on point here to just say, oh, no damage done, we didn't lose any taxpayer money. Yeah, except the chairman and I and Mr. Graves were in Puerto Rico, and it's the rainy season. So these people have had their roofs taken off their houses by the hurricane, and the tarps didn't show up, so more damage has ensued. So yes, there has been more damage, there has been more cost because of this malfeasance, and we need to find out how FEMA lets these kind of contracts and why we're seeing a pattern here that seems a bit odd of companies that have 1, 2, or no employees and no previous experience are getting contracts. So I congratulate the gentleman on this amendment.
Thank the gentleman. Any other members wish to be heard on this amendment? Seeing none, are there amendments to the amendment? Seeing none, if not, the question is on the amendment. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying nay. The ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. Now recognize Mr. Mast for his amendment. Mr. Mast.
Thank you, Chairman. I ask unanimous consent that it be considered as read.
Without objection, so ordered. The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 45 offered by Mr. Mast.
With that, I recognize the gentleman to speak on his amendment.
Mr. Chairman, the Stafford Act, it authorizes the President to allocate disaster resources at the request of the governor when the emergency exists for which the primary responsibility for response rests with the federal government. In 2016, the governor of Florida declared an emergency when the federal government discharged billions of gallons of toxic water into my district and other districts throughout Florida. At one point, over 4 million gallons per minute laden with green algae, which you will see in a video in just a few moments. Florida asked the president, under the authority granted by the Stafford Act, for help to remove the toxic algal discharge that was discharged by the Corps of Engineers to these separate coastal bodies of water. It killed fish, it killed animals, it harmed humans, it contaminated water, it contaminated food, it inflicted municipal health emergencies. It closed whole industries that imposed economic loss that economists are still struggling to calculate to this day. It destroyed ecosystems, causing chain reactions of broad environmental consequences that the scientific community is still trying to understand to this day. Florida was 2 times denied by the Obama administration an emergency declaration and federal resources under Section 501B of the Federal Stafford Act, citing that supplemental federal assistance under the Stafford Act was not appropriate for this event. So, Mr. Chairman, I do ask unanimous consent to enter into the record the following items. Denial for disaster assistance dated July 15, 2016 and August 25, 2016.
Without objection, so ordered.
The amendment that I'm offering, it simply adds that clarity to the Stafford Act by listing toxic algal blooms resulting from the Corps of Engineers flood control efforts as an example of an emergency for which the United States exercises exclusive or preeminent responsibility and authority. This amendment makes no change to the procedure or authority of the President to declare an emergency. It only adds an example. It adds the clarity that has been cited as missing of a disaster event that warrants consideration. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, they do routinely discharge toxic into our Florida rivers, both preemptively and also in response to natural disasters. We've had 4 months of discharges as a result of Hurricanes Irma and Marina this year. I hope that I can count on my colleagues on this committee to work with me on untying the hands of the executive branch to provide the accountability that we all deserve from federally caused disasters. In that, I would ask that you please direct your attention to the screens to see the video of what this disaster looks like, and that you thank God that you don't have to smell it or breathe it yourself.
I'm at the Port Mayaca Lock-In Dam on Lake Okeechobee, and when water levels in the big lake get too high, those gates open and all that water comes rushing toward our coastal communities.
February 5th, 2016, the Army Corps of Engineers announced it would begin releasing the maximum amount of water from Lake Okeechobee to the St. Lucie estuary.
Jump 3 months later, blue-green algae was spotted along the St. Lucie riverbanks. Signs went up in some areas warning people not to come into contact with the water.
June, high levels of toxins were found where the algae blooms were inches thick. The toxins that could be in the air are putting their health at risk.
The short-term acute exposure can cause very massive liver failure, longer-term liver damage, reduced liver function, and ultimately liver cancer.
Besides attacking the liver, scientists fear worse damage from what they call HABs. 61 people died after algae blooms at several freshwater lakes.
And with that, Chairman, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman for offering this amendment. This is an important issue. I've been down to Florida with the gentleman, and in fact been on both coasts. It pretty much stretches from the east coast of Florida to the west coast, again impacting a number of communities in Florida. And if the gentleman withdraws this amendment, I'm committed to work with him on this important issue as we work through a WERDA process. I think it's more appropriate that we deal with it there. So if the gentleman is willing to withdraw, he's got my commitment to as we do WERDA, and we've already kicked that off. We intend to do a WERDA bill next year.
Chairman, I will withdraw this amendment at this time and ask for the entire committee's support for a solution to this ongoing catastrophe.
Well, I thank the gentleman, and as I said, I commit to work with you as we move forward because, again, I've seen it. Members seen. I don't know if they've been down there live, but that certainly, that 30-second clip there really tells the story pretty well. Again, I thank the gentleman. And with that, I recognize Mr. Huffman for an amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I certainly want to echo the words of our many colleagues who pointed out the hard work that's gone into this bipartisan bill. I appreciate the several provisions in it already work to address some of my concerns.
Mr. Huffman, we'll make sure we go through the procedure. Is there an amendment at the desk?
I have an amendment.
Yes, there is.
at the desk.
But is
Thank
clerk designated? I want to make sure you get a number.
Amendment number 116, offered by Mr. Huffman.
Stipulations.
Without objection, so designated, the gentleman's recognized to speak.
I apologize, Mr. Chairman. So the bill already does work to address many of my concerns. It provides important aid to communities affected by wildfires. Communities like those that I represent in Northern California still recovering right now from one of the most destructive fires in our country's history. It's not enough to just wait for disaster to strike, and this bill includes important provisions to help communities be more proactive. Of the 21 fatalities identified in Sonoma County, which I represent along with Mike Thompson, 18 were at least 67 years of age, and that demonstrates how vulnerable the elderly population is to sudden disasters like the October wildfires that ripped through our community. So Section 205 of this bill specifically mentions paying attention to special populations like the elderly, the homeless, the disabled when we're planning evacuation routes. I really appreciate that. I hope we can build on these provisions so the communities can better plan for their needs in an emergency in addition to just evacuation routes. My amendment is another way that we can be more proactive in addressing natural disasters like wildfires. This amendment actually is comprised of language that has already passed the House with Republican support. It amends the Stafford Act to allow wildfires to be designated as major disasters. And that provides agencies with additional funding through the Disaster Relief Fund to fight fires and to protect communities. The problem is under current law, when the Interior and Ag departments are fighting fires but have exhausted their wildfire suppression budgets, they have to borrow from other accounts, robbing their important programs of the resources they need. This is not a sustainable solution, which is why for years many of us have worked together advocating a fix to the way we budget for wildfire suppression. To fully fix the problem would require something like the Bipartisan Wildfire Disaster Funding Act, which is beyond the scope of this committee, and I acknowledge that, Mr. Chairman. Although my amendment does not represent a complete or a perfect fix to the fire borrowing problem, it is something that this committee can do right now to make progress to help resolve the wildfire suppression budget problem facing our federal land management agencies. So I urge its adoption, and I hope that we can develop it further together as the bill moves to the floor so that we can finally solve this fire borrowing problem and make our communities safer. I appreciate the time, and I yield back.
I thank the gentleman for offering this amendment. The amendment would allow the Departments of Interior and Agriculture to directly compete with states like Texas and Florida, Puerto Rico, and the U.S. Virgin Islands for the same limited pot of disaster funds. And let me be clear, wildfires are a serious issue. We know how devastating they are and have been. That is why H.R. 4460 includes provisions to strengthen our mitigation against response to wildfires. Wildfires currently covered under the Stafford Act provide assistance to states and locals, but this amendment expands Stafford Act coverage to allow other federal agencies to compete for states and territories for, again, that limited pool of money. And again, Mr. Westerman has offered a bill, and it is already moving through the House. Dealing with this very issue. Again, the big problem is the limited amount of money, and I would urge my Democratic colleagues as we move forward to deal with the raising of the caps on a budget deal. I would encourage all my Democratic colleagues to support that deal if you're committed to seeing this amount of money increase so that we can deal with the situation that occurs mainly in the West. So again, at this point, I oppose the amendment, and again would encourage all members to take a look at Mr. Westerman's bill and support a caps deal as we move forward. And with that, any other members, which Mr. DeFazio is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The issue being raised by the gentleman from California has been a priority of mine since I was a ranking member on the Resources Committee. You know, the Westerman bill does contain some language Unfortunately, there are other provisions of the bill that prevented many of us from supporting it, and in its current form, it won't be going anywhere in the Senate. Last year, we passed a more moderate version of his bill and didn't go anywhere in the Senate. So I think it would be essential to address this issue here in this legislation, which I believe is going to go forward with the Senate. And, you know, we've got to, you know, the chairman talked about the limited amount of money. There's no limited amount of money. There is no money. You know, the flood insurance, flood insurance program's broke. FEMA doesn't have a giant disaster account. We just appropriate the money and borrow it. So why not appropriate a little more and borrow it to get ahead of the forest fire problem, as opposed to having the Forest Service borrow the money and you know, delay contracting and disrupt their regular budget procedures every fire season. Every fire season they do that, and then Congress, after October 1st, gives them the money back. We borrow the money from somewhere else. Let's just be upfront about what we're doing here. We're underfunding government, many essential programs. We're about to reduce revenues by a couple of $1 trillion, and we're borrowing money. So let's just be honest about it and adopt this amendment.
Thank the gentleman. With that, recognize Mr. Westerman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate the gentleman from California and his concern for the wildfire borrowing problem, or the fire funding, as you hear it called often. And we did address this in the Resilient Federal Forest Act that passed out of the House with bipartisan support. I would encourage members to contact their senators to get that bill through the House and get it signed into law. There's a problem with the amendment that the gentleman offered. He actually picked the language out of the Resilient Federal Forest Act, except for the last section that deals with the budget disaster caps under the Budget Control Act. There's a chart on the TV. You might not be able to read that very well, but this was produced by FEMA, and it shows that in 2015, the disaster caps were $18.4 billion. The actual FEMA spending was $6.5 billion. In 2016, the disaster caps were $14.1 billion. The actual spending was $7.6. Now, this chart was developed in April of this year before hurricane season, but by the formula in the Budget Control Act, the disaster caps for FEMA were down to $8.1 billion, and that's before any of the emergency spending that had to take place. By formula, next year, the disaster caps will be down to $7.4 billion. So the problem with the fix the gentleman's proposed is that there is no money in FEMA to pay for fire borrowing, even if this bill was passed or this amendment was passed. What's in the Resilient Federal Forest Act, it also deals with adjusting the disaster caps in the Budget Control Act, which is actually a much bigger issue as we think about FEMA than even fire borrowing or a lot of these other funding problems that we face. So I appreciate the attempt to fix the fire borrowing problem, but this isn't the right way to fix it. This amendment would actually magnify the disaster cap problem facing FEMA because of the Budget Control Act. It's an ineffective approach to fix fire borrowing, since any request for fire borrowing or fire funding would have to be done through emergency spending, since FEMA will be up to their caps before they even start next year. And that's what happened this year. We did an emergency spending bill for the Forest Service to offset some of the fire costs. And even if this amendment were in place and there were extra spending to fight fires, we would have to go back with an emergency spending bill before there would be any money available. And finally, this amendment is a one-sided approach that is only designed to throw more money at a problem, even though the money is not there. The side this argument doesn't address is the forest management part that is in the Resilient Federal Forest Act. And by implementing sound forest management and science, we can actually decrease the money needed for fire borrowing by decreasing the number of fires. So we can't even say this would just be a Band-Aid, because you normally put a Band-Aid on a cut. This would be like putting a Band-Aid on a broken bone. It would be ineffective, and I urge everyone to vote against this amendment. Yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Any other members wish to be heard on this amendment? Seeing none, are there amendments to the amendment? Seeing none, the question is on the amendment. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signifying saying nay. Nay. The nays have it. The amendment is not agreed to. A recorded vote has been requested. A recorded vote was requested. A sufficient number of members have requested a recorded vote, and pursuant to Rule 5E of the Rules of the Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure, a recorded vote on the amendment is ordered. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Schuster?
No.
Mr. Schuster votes no. Mr. DeFazio? Mr. DeFazio votes aye. Mr. Young? Ms. Norton? Ms. Norton votes aye. Mr. Duncan? Mr. Duncan votes no. Mr. Nadler? Mr. Lobiondo? Mr. Lobiondo votes no. Ms. Johnson of Texas? Ms. Johnson votes aye. Mr. Graves of Missouri? Mr. Graves votes no. Mr. Cummings? Mr. Hunter? Mr. Hunter votes no. Mr. Larson? Mr. Larson votes yes. Mr. Crawford? Mr. Crawford votes no. Mr. Capuano? Mr. Capuano votes yes. Mr. Barletta? Mr. Barletta votes no. Mrs. Napolitano? Mrs. Napolitano votes aye. Mr. Farenthold? Mr. Farenthold votes no. Mr. Lipinski? Mr. Gibbs? Mr. Gibbs votes no. Mr. Cohen? Mr. Webster? Mr. Sears? Mr. Sears votes aye. Mr. Denham? Mr. Denham votes no. Mr. Garamendi? Mr. Garamendi votes aye. Mr. Massey? Mr. Massey votes no. Mr. Johnson of Georgia? Mr. Johnson votes aye. Mr. Meadows? Mr. Meadows votes no. Mr. Carson? Mr. Perry? Mr. Nolan? Mr. Nolan votes aye. Mr. Davis? Mr. Davis votes no. Ms. Titus? Ms. Titus votes aye. Mr. Sanford? Mr. Sanford votes no. Mr. Maloney? Mr. Maloney votes aye. Mr. Woodall? Ms. Esty? Ms. Esty votes aye. Mr. Rokita? Mr. Rokita votes no. Ms. Frankel? Mr. Katko? Mr. Katko votes no. Mrs. Bustos? Mrs. Bustos votes aye. Mr. Babin? Mr. Babin votes no. Mr. Huffman? Mr. Huffman votes aye. Mr. Graves of Louisiana? Mr. Graves votes no. Ms. Brownlee? Ms. Brownlee votes aye. Mrs. Comstock? Mrs. Comstock votes no. Ms. Wilson? Ms. Wilson votes aye. Mr. Rouser? Mr. Rouser votes no. Mr. Payne? Mr. Payne votes aye. Mr. Bost? Mr. Bost votes no. Mr. Lowenthal? Mr. Lowenthal votes aye. Mr. Weber? Mr. Weber votes no. Ms. Lawrence? Ms. Lawrence votes aye. Mr. LaMalfa? Mr. LaMalfa votes no. Mr. DeSaulnier? Mr. DeSaulnier votes aye. Mr. Westerman? Mr. Westerman votes no. Mr. Smucker? Mr. Smucker votes no. Mr. Mitchell? Mr. Mitchell votes no. Mr. Faso? Mr. Faso votes no. Mr. Ferguson? Mr. Ferguson votes no. Mr. Mast? Mr. Mast votes no. Mr. Lewis? Mr. Lewis votes no.
Do any other members wish to be recorded? Ms. Frankel, how's Ms. Frankel recorded? Aye.
Aye. Ms. Frankel votes aye.
Mr. Woodall? Any other members wish to be recorded? Seeing none, all members cast their vote. The clerk will record the vote.
So, on this vote, the nays are 31, the ayes are 22.
With that, the amendment is not agreed to. I now ask unanimous consent to consider the following amendments in block and to allow any member to be recognized for 5 minutes on the in-block amendment. The amendments are Mr. Gibbs, 15, Mr. Meadows, 94, Mr. Graves, 84, as revised, Mr. Graves, 85, as revised, Mr. Graves, 88, as revised, and Mr. DeFazio, 81. Is there an objection? Without objection, so ordered. Do any members wish to be recognized on the in-block amendments? Mr. Gibbs is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you for including my amendment in the in-block. My amendment would address the serious issues of windstorm damage caused from many natural disasters, including hurricanes that's devastated lots of the United States earlier this year. This amendment simply allows recipients of hazard mitigation assistance under the bill to use this assistance in affected areas by windstorms to replace utility poles with more resilient poles. It does not mandate any specific material, and I think it's a good fit in here when we include if you look in the language of Section 104, Section 203 of the bill, with wildfire and the list there, but it also includes for windstorm damage, and so they have the ability to replace those poles that maybe will be able to stand hurricane force winds or ice or whatever in future natural disasters. So thank you again for including it, and I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Any other members wish to be heard on the in-block amendments? Well, considering the gentleman has half the in-block amendments, I have to recognize Mr. Graves from Louisiana.
I thought these were a gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Graves' amendments. Mr. Chairman, thank you very much, and I do want to, again, thank you and Mr. DeFazio and all the staff for working with us on this. There are 3 amendments that are included in this en bloc that I think are very important that you've included. Number one of them clarifies existing law that relief organizations such as Food Bank, the Feeding America member food banks, and St. Vincent de Paul type organizations are eligible for providing food to flood victims, to disaster victims following a disaster. In many cases, these organizations are already equipped and situated to provide mass feeding opportunities, and their specific inclusion in this amendment, I think, is going to be very helpful in providing faster service to flood victims. Number 2, the amendment extends the authorization for the arbitration panel that expired in 2015. That panel gives states and municipalities a quick resolution to conflicts that come up in occasion on the eligibility of public assistance claims. This was a very helpful tool that was used following Hurricane Katrina. It was also used following Hurricane Sandy, and with the various disasters that we've had in the past few years, and knowing firsthand some of the conflicts that are out there right now related to FEMA, states and counties and parishes, I think this is going to be helpful once again in quickly resolving some of these claims. And lastly, there has been a change in FEMA policy related to inundated roads. This is a policy that we have spoken to many folks in Texas about, as well as in Louisiana and other places, and it just has to do with the impact on the service life of inundated roads. And so this amendment does provide for FEMA and the Federal Highway Administration to come together to develop the appropriate guidelines regarding the service life impacts on submerged roads, inundated roads related to floods, hurricanes, and other types of disasters. I want to again thank you for working with us on a bipartisan basis to ensure these improvements to the bill were included. And Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent that a letter from the Greater Baton Rouge Food Bank, Mr. Michael Manning, who is a former chairperson of the National VOAD organization, included in the record that clarifies the role that food banks can play and VOADs can play on a national basis in terms of disaster response.
Without objection, so ordered.
Yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Do any other members? Mr. DeFazio is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Straightforward amendment. You and I and Mr. Graves traveled both to St. Thomas and to Puerto Rico and saw the incredible devastation. And there is no way that the efforts in the Virgin Islands can be accomplished under the current caps. It says under the ER program, in any fiscal year, no more than $20 million can be expended in in the total of the 4 territories, Virgin Islands, Guam, American Samoa, Commonwealth, and Northern Marianas. Obviously, what we witnessed there far, far exceeds those numbers, and this amendment would just lift the cap for this year for the Virgin Islands and next year. Thank you. Corrected by staff. And next year. Yield back.
I thank the gentleman, and I agree with the gentleman. As mentioned, Mr. DeFazio, Mr. Graves, myself traveled to both Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands, and the devastation there was significant. So I think this is an amendment that we're going to, it's a wise amendment. It's an amendment we need to do to address the situation down in Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands. So I agree with the gentleman. And do any other members wish to be heard on the in-block amendments? Seeing none. Seeing none. The question is on the in-block amendment. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying nay. The ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. I now call up Mr. Hunter has an amendment. Is Mr. Hunter? With that, I recognize Mr. Hunter for his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I intend to withdraw this amendment, but first I want to thank Garrett Graves for offering this amendment with me and outline why we offered this amendment in the first place.
Mr. Hunter, we got to make sure, is the amendment at desk?
Amendment
and
is
will
at
the
desk.
clerk designate the amendment?
Amendment number 72, offered by Mr. Hunter.
It must be a California thing. With that, Mr. Hunter is recognized to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. During disaster recovery, we should be using every resource our country has to bring aid to our fellow citizens. Today, there are dozens of American-flagged, American-built, and American cruise ships that could provide aid to our fellow citizens in Puerto Rico. Unfortunately, Coast Guard regulations are getting in the way of allowing these ships to provide needed aid. Instead of common sense prevailing, American ships are being held back at the dock for technical reasons that do nothing to increase maritime or environmental safety. My amendment would have given the Secretary waiver authority to allow these ships to provide aid in the instance of a major disaster or emergency declaration. Again, these are American-flagged, American-built, American-crewed, Jones Act-compliant ships. The waiver authority was limited and could only be used when it was determined that the waiver would not harm maritime safety or the environment, and only during the unavailability of U.S. ships that met current Coast Guard requirements. So what the Coast Guard is doing is using technicalities to keep these ships from providing aid during disasters. This is what the amendment was trying to fix. We'll look to it in the future in the Coast Guard bill, and I would ask you, Mr. Chairman, and the ranking member to work with me on this and try to get the Coast Guard out of their own way. And with that, I'd like to yield to Mr. Graves from Louisiana.
Thank you. I want to thank Mr. Hunter for putting this amendment together, the chairman of the Coast Guard and Maritime Subcommittee. As was noted, what we saw after hurricanes, the hurricanes this year, as you know, White House did a Jones Act waiver pulling in foreign vessels, when the reality is you have vessels like OSVs, offshore service vessels, supply vessels, that are capable of doing the exact type of deliveries that the Jones Act waiver was designed to try and attract. There is a technical difference between an OSV and other types of vessels. On a regular basis, they deliver fuel. They offload it in extraordinary sea state conditions in the offshore, yet they were prohibited from doing so in Puerto Rico. As a result, in some cases, they tried to lure in foreign vessels rather than using Jones Act vessels. This is simply an exemption that would allow the waiver for OSVs to deliver fuel and other types of supplies when other capacity is insufficient. It makes sense for us to use domestic vessels rather than dependent upon foreign vessels in a situation like this. As the Chairman Hunter said, using all of our domestic assets simply makes sense in the event of a disaster. This does not threaten safety. It does not box out other domestic vessels. It is a waiver when sufficient domestic capacity, other sufficient domestic capacity is not available, and urge adoption of the amendments.
I thank the gentleman. Any other members wish to be heard on this amendment? It's my understanding the gentleman was withdrawing the amendment.
I withdraw the amendment.
And I commit to the gentleman that we'll continue to work on this. This is a complex issue, something, of course, I support the Jones Act, and as we move forward to the next Coast Guard reauthorization, we'll be working with the gentleman on this issue. So I appreciate him offering and withdrawing the amendment. And with that, recognize Mr. Graves has an amendment. Is the amendment at the desk?
The amendment is at the desk.
And the clerk designate the amendment.
Amendment number 90, offered by Mr. Graves.
With that, Mr. Graves recognized.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for your indulgence. I apologize for taking up so much airtime. Section 208 of the legislation does make a significant improvement in what's known as the STEP program. It allows the states to lead a temporary sheltering program. In the case of Louisiana and other disasters, FEMA has spent up to $150,000 for mobile housing units, for trailers, to house families impacted by disasters. Alternatively, there's a program in Louisiana called Shelter at Home. There's a STEP program in Texas. One was used after Hurricane Sandy in New York that basically allows for temporary work to be done on people's homes and allowing them to shelter in place, to shelter at their own homes. The problem is they're doing things like putting in plastic sinks, doing 2-by-2 foot pieces of sheetrock and other things that are all being completely ripped out and eliminated. They're wasted. And so you have an alternative of $150,000 you're spending on a mobile home that they've turned around and sold in Louisiana for $5,000 per unit. Or you can do a more robust temporary sheltering program at folks' homes. All we're trying to do is we're trying to build upon Section 208 of this legislation and not just allow state-led STEP programs, but allow federally led STEP programs in the instance where states or local governments don't have the capacity to lead these, giving them more flexibility to spend money in a cost-effective manner and not limiting them to temporary fixes, temporary sheltering. I want to be clear, Mr. Chairman, I know you're sensitive to this and I'm sensitive to this as well. This is not an effort to try and increase federal expenditures. It is simply allowing FEMA to use cost-effective measures and ultimately to save money over pushing people toward the $150,000 trailers. It is our expectation that this would probably be in an average range of approximately $15,000 to $20,000 per home, or approximately 1/10 of what they're spending on the mobile home units. I understand, Mr. Chairman, that this amendment perhaps needs a little bit of work to ensure that we generate the cost savings you and I have discussed. And with that, I appreciate the opportunity to discuss it, but I will withdraw.
I thank the gentleman, and we did have a discussion and have had discussions. We'll continue to work with the gentleman because, you know, across government, we see this type of thing happening, especially in natural disasters. So I'm committed to working with the gentleman. I understand the gentleman is withdrawing the amendment. And with that, again, I appreciate the gentleman's work, and I've got my commitment to continue working with him on this to save those precious federal dollars. So with that, thank the gentleman. And then there's an amendment at the desk. Mr. Graves, 91, the clerk designate.
Amendment number 91, offered by Mr. Graves.
And with that, I recognize Mr. Graves.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, as you and I have discussed, this amendment is being offered at the request of Congresswoman Plaskett, who represents the Virgin Islands. We did travel there and see some of the unique challenges in the Virgin Islands and other areas. What this amendment would do is it would give more flexibility to FEMA in terms of their rebuilding efforts in Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands. To ensure, as the intent of this bill, that we're being more proactive, that we're building truly resilient construction as we come back and replace. So the idea is that we're not just rebuilding, we're actually rebuilding more resiliently for future storms and disasters that we know will strike Puerto Rico, will strike the Virgin Islands. Mr. Chairman, while this could result in temporarily increasing ultimate expenditures as compared to current law, this no doubt will save money over time by ensuring that in future disasters we don't have the same type of devastation we saw. Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member, you're aware of the walls that were blown out of houses and apartment buildings and other things that we saw just from wind. This would allow for more flexibility in terms of microgrid and ensuring the resiliency of the electrical system as well. I want to say here as well that I do know that perhaps this language that we just received yesterday could use a little bit of perfecting. I want to ask Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member, if y'all would agree to work with us moving forward on this legislation to address some of the specific needs in Puerto Rico and in the Virgin Islands to ensure that we're making cost-effective investments. I think it is consistent with the more resilient nature, the more resilient posture that this bill is moving in regard to disaster preparedness and response.
Again, I'm certainly committed to working with gentlemen. Again, we've had this discussion that as we move forward, we'll continue to work on this and improve it. And with that, recognize Mr. DeFazio.
I echo the chairman's remarks.
With that, I withdraw.
I thank the gentleman. And again, we'll work together. As was said earlier, the three of us, the ranking member, Mr. Graves, and I, saw firsthand the devastation and want to work to make sure we improve things going forward. Are there any amendments to the amendment? To the amendment? Are there any other amendments? Seeing no other amendments, I recognize Ms. Barletta for a motion.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move that H.R. 4460 as amended be approved and reported favorably to the House.
I thank the gentleman. And the questions on the motion. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying nay. The ayes have it. The motion is agreed to. The bill is amended and approved and ordered reported favorably to the House. We will next consider H.R. 3814, the No Human Trafficking on Our Roads Act. I ask unanimous consent to discharge the Highways Transit Subcommittee and call up H.R. 3814 and that it be considered as read and open to amendment at any point. Is there an objection? Without objection, so ordered. I want to thank Mr. Katko and Vice Ranking Member Estes for their work on this important bipartisan legislation. No one who has used a commercial motor vehicle to engage in human trafficking should ever be given the opportunity to do it again. H.R. 3814 would ensure that that is the case. I urge all members to support 3814, and I recognize Subcommittee Chairman Graves of Missouri to explain the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, it's estimated that over 20 million human trafficking victims, there are over 20 million human trafficking victims worldwide. And even more troubling is the fact that about 20% of these victims are children. Just this past summer, there was a case in San Antonio in which 10 people died that were being illegally trafficked by a commercial motor vehicle. Drivers have been the first line of defense in helping identify and report these sorts of activities within the trucking community. But the drivers of companies who are knowingly taking part in these activities should never again be able to drive commercially. Right now, current law prohibits an individual from operating a commercial motor vehicle if they are convicted of one of 9 different offenses, including alcohol abuse, negligent manslaughter, and drug trafficking. H.R. 3814 would disqualify individuals from operating a commercial motor vehicle for life if they use a commercial vehicle to commit a felony involving human trafficking. H.R. 3814 is supported by members on both sides of the aisle, and I urge my colleagues to pass the bill favorably. Thank you, and I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. With that, recognize Mr. Katko.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm proud to speak today on 2 pieces of bipartisan legislation I authored alongside Representative Estes to further our nation's effort to combat human trafficking. As a former organized crime prosecutor on both the northern border at home in New York and on the southern border in El Paso, Texas, I've seen firsthand the horrors of human trafficking. Too often, human traffickers take advantage of our nation's transportation network to transport their victims from one location to the next. The U.S. Department of Transportation, Department of Homeland Security, and the transportation industry play a critical role in preventing and stopping these heinous exploitations. I want to commend the trucking industry for their commitment to training drivers to identify and address instances of human trafficking through organizations like Truckers Against Trafficking. Truck drivers are often a critical asset in helping law enforcement identify victims who otherwise might go unseen. However, an isolated few individuals have taken advantage of their position to illegally traffic innocent people. We must stop this from occurring. Our bill, H.R. 3814, the No Human Trafficking on Our Roads Act, forbids any individual who's convicted of knowingly trafficking human beings from holding a commercial driver's license. A similar ban is currently in place for drug trafficking, in which a felony conviction carries a lifetime ban. While the vast majority of our nation's truck drivers are hardworking, honest men and women, it is imperative that the select few who commit these crimes are brought to justice. I'm grateful to have teamed up once again with my good friend on the other side of the aisle, Congresswoman Estes, on these 2 bills. I would also like to thank the chairman and committee staff for working with us on these bills and for their commitment to ending the crime of human trafficking. I would like to also thank Representative Estes and Senators Soon and Klobuchar for their bipartisan, bicameral leadership, and yield back the balance of my time.
I thank the gentleman. Now recognize Ms. Estes for a statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank my friend and colleague, Mr. Cadco for his excellent work on both of these pieces of legislation. Sex trafficking and human trafficking are inhumane and awful crimes. They occur in communities all over America. And I learned about this when a human trafficking operation was stopped in my hometown of Cheshire, Connecticut. And it was a reminder that this can affect anyone, anywhere, anytime. No gender, no race, no socioeconomic status protects you. This appalling crime takes many forms, and the vast majority of them are sexually exploitative in nature. Shockingly, the average age a teen enters the sex trade in the United States is 12 to 14 years old. Many victims are runaway girls who were sexually abused as children. And truckers and commercial drivers are often the very first line of defense against human trafficking in the United States. Their eyes and ears are on the road, where victims are being moved across borders and from city to city. And both of these bills will help address that. The bill we're discussing right now, 3814, specifically adds those who are engaged in trafficking of human trafficking and prohibits them for a lifetime ban from using their commercial driver's license. This is an important step, not only of respect for the importance of these crimes, but in fact getting the few bad apples, the few bad actors off the road and ensuring we're keeping our children and keeping others safe. So again, I want to support my friend and colleague and want to thank the chairman and ranking member for the first of these two bills. Thank you very much, and I yield back.
I thank the gentlelady, and with that, recognize the ranking member, Ms. Norton, for a statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for putting this amendment on the calendar. Human trafficking has long been recognized as a bipartisan issue, and fighting it is not new to this committee or to the Congress, and it should not be difficult for any of us to vote for this bill. In the last 10 years, the National Human Trafficking Hotline reported more than 22,000 sex trafficking cases inside the United States, and in addition, 5,000 reports of individuals who have been coerced into what amounts to forced labor. Who in the world are the victims? And that's where we should be looking. They are the most vulnerable members of the society. 1 in every 6 runaways has been a victim of sex trafficking. Hispanic and African American people and children are disproportionately represented among the victims. This bill ensures that the Federal Motor Carrier Administration will take action against those who use commercial vehicles to commit, and the word is severe, forms of sex trafficking, and that word is defined in the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. Those who take advantage of children or use violence to force others into labor should not have access to commercial vehicles. I support this legislation and urge its adoption. Thank you again, Mr. Chairman, and yield back.
I thank the gentlelady. Any other members wish to be heard? Seeing none, we will not consider for the bill for amendment. Seeing no amendments, I now recognize Mr. Graves of Missouri for a motion.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I move that H.R. 3814 be approved and reported favorably to the House of Representatives.
Questions on the motion? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying nay. The ayes have it. The motion is agreed to. The resolution is approved and ordered reported favorably to the House. We will next consider H.R. 3813, the Combating Human Trafficking in Commercial Vehicles Act. I ask unanimous consent to discharge Highways Transit Subcommittee and call up H.R. 3813, and that be considered as read and open amendment at any point. Is there rejection? Without objection, so ordered. I want to thank Vice Ranking Member Estes and Mr. Katko for the work on this important bipartisan legislation. Needless to say, human trafficking is an appalling crime, and we should take common sense steps to reduce it. H.R. 3813 would deploy a variety of tactics to help combat human trafficking on our nation's roads. I urge all members to support H.R. 3813 and now recognize Subcommittee Chairman Graves of Missouri to explain the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, H.R. 3813 empowers the Department of Transportation to play an important role in coordinating human trafficking. Specifically, the bill directs the Secretary of Transportation to designate a human trafficking prevention coordinator from within the department. It expands the scope of activities authorized under the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration's outreach and education program and commercial driver's license financial assistance program to include human trafficking prevention activities, and requires the Secretary to establish an advisory committee on human trafficking. H.R. 3813 is supported by members on both sides of the aisle, and I'd urge my colleagues to support the bill. And with that, I would yield back the balance of my time.
I thank the gentleman and now recognize Mr. DeFazio for a statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We need to be certain that all federal agencies are employing any and all tools they have in their jurisdiction to prevent human trafficking, and this would give clarity to the authority of the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration, and I strongly endorse the legislation and congratulate the gentlelady for its introduction.
I thank the gentleman and now recognize Subcommittee Ranking Member Ms. Norton for a statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Like the previous bill, this bill takes an important step to reduce human trafficking. It further enables the Department of Transportation to deal with human trafficking across the board. That means on roads, rails, airways, and other transportation modes. It is our responsibility to ensure that the department has both the authority and the resources. The advisory committee established by this bill will convene experts from law enforcement, victim advocacy organizations, and industry to advise DOT on very specific and concrete steps it can take to improve the recognition and prevention of trafficking. The committee will also share best practices with state and local stakeholders so that they are better equipped to combat trafficking in their communities at that level. The bill requires the Department of Transportation to designate an official responsible for coordinating its efforts with other agencies and to give the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration flexibility to use existing funds. Note, no new funds are necessary to tackle this problem. These efforts will help ensure the agency is more effectively combating trafficking. Again, I'm pleased to see us working together on this important issue, and I urge adoption of this bill.
I thank the gentlelady, and with that, recognize the sponsor of the bill, Ms. Estes, for a statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your support, Mr. Chairman, and for Ranking Member DeFazio, and to my good friend and former prosecutor, Mr. Katko, for joining me in these two important pieces of legislation. The Combating Human Trafficking in Commercial Vehicles Act would help stem the tide of trafficking by providing training to commercial truck drivers through the Department of Transportation to recognize and report trafficking, further empowering our truckers to prevent this horrendous crime. Specifically, the bill designates a human trafficking prevention coordinator at the U.S. Department of Transportation and increases outreach, education, and reporting efforts at the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration. And the bill will also, importantly, share best practices with the states so that we ensure that all states benefit from the knowledge of those who are doing the best job. The Combating Human Trafficking in Commercial Vehicles Act is supported by many organizations, including the Truckers Against Trafficking, the National District Attorneys Association, the Commercial Vehicle Safety Alliance, the Owner-Operator Independent Drivers Association, and ECPAT USA. This bill, which was introduced by Senators Thune and Klobuchar, has passed unanimously in the Senate, and I encourage all my colleagues to vote yes on both this and on the No Human Trafficking on Our Roads Act here in the House today, so we can move these important pieces of bipartisan legislation forward to the President for signature. Thank you, and I yield back.
I thank the gentlelady. Any other members wish to be recognized?
Mr. Chairman.
With that, Mr. Katko is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm proud to speak in support of this legislation which works to increase the effectiveness of human trafficking prevention efforts within the Department of Transportation. This is yet another critical step forward in fighting human trafficking across our country. I appreciate having been able to work closely with Congresswoman Estes on this bill and commend her leadership on this issue and many others. I encourage all of my colleagues to vote in favor of this bill, and I yield back the balance of my time.
I thank the gentleman and thank him for his work on this bill, as well as Ms. Estes. Thank you so much. With that, are there any members which to be heard? Seeing none, now we now consider the bill for amendment. Seeing none, I now recognize Mr. Graves of Missouri for a motion.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I move that H.R. 3813 be approved and reported favorably to the House of Representatives.
Questions on the motion? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying nay. The ayes have it. The motion is agreed to. The resolution is approved and reported favorably to the House. I ask unanimous consent that each bill ordered reported today will be reported as a single amendment in the nature of a substitute, incorporating any amendments adopted. Without objection, so ordered. I ask unanimous consent that the staff be authorized to make all necessary technical, clarifying, and conforming changes to each of the bills ordered reported today to reflect the actions of the committee. Without objection, so ordered. I ask unanimous consent that the chairman, after consultation with the ranking member, has authority to strike or revise any provision of the bills ordered reported today that would cause a sequential referral to another committee, or that would cause the bills or concurrent resolutions to be subject to a Budget Act or Rule 21 cut-go point of order. Without objection, so ordered. Pursuant to Clause 1 of Rule 22, I ask unanimous consent the committee authorize the chairman or his designee to offer such motions as necessary in the House to go to conference with the Senate on H.R. 4460 as amended, H.R. 3814 and H.R. 3813, ordered reported by the committee today, or similar Senate bills. Without objection, so ordered. Pursuant to Rule 5 of the Rules of the Committee of Transportation and Infrastructure, the chair notes presence of a quorum and for actions taken on all committee business today. With that, the Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure has completed its business for the day, and the committee is adjourned.
All right. Thank you.
Yes, sir.